Well, the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty has done one as well. Their team has looked for election irregularities and evidence of hijinks, and the head of WIL, Rick Esenberg, joins me now to talk about it. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Good morning. How are you doing, Jay?
Doing real well. This is about a 115-page report on your findings that's being released today, and we have it linked up. We're going to have it linked up on jwebershow.com, and we'll have it on social media as well for people who want to do a deep dive. It's just such an extensive and exhaustive report that we can't do it justice in a 15-minute radio segment, but let's try to give some flavor of this. Let's start with the mission of your investigation. What questions did you want to answer or focus on?
Well, the mission of the investigation was to find out what really happened. In the wake of the 2020 election, there were two camps. One camp was claiming that the election had been stolen and had various theories of election fraud. And the other camp was saying that there's nothing to see here, that we should just move on, that there was nothing irregular about the 2020 election. So we decided to test those propositions, look for evidence of fraudulent behavior, and over a period of about 7 or 8 months, we had a team of researchers led by our research director, Dr. Will Flanders, and our policy director, Kyle Conan, examine a number of aspects of the 2020 election, and the report that we released today reflects what they were able to find.
As I want to emphasize, over the course of 7 or 8 months, you had a team of researchers looking at this, and you approached it in an unbiased manner. Let's just figure out what the truth is. The overall conclusion is that the truth of the 2020 election lies somewhere between the big steal claim and there's nothing to see here claim that the Democrats and the media members are making. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Let's think of two categories of votes. One category of votes would be what I would call just straight out fraudulent votes. Votes that were cast by someone who is ineligible to vote or who didn't exist, or there was some manipulation of the count so that the final count didn't reflect the actual number of votes cast. We found some evidence of that in the margins, but really very little of it. That wasn't the problem with the 2020 election. But that doesn't mean that there was nothing to see, because we found a substantial number of votes that had been cast in ways that weren't provided for by law. These involved votes that were cast by drop boxes, some votes that were cast by people who claimed to be indefinitely confined and who were not, and therefore did not show a photo ID, some votes that were cast absentee at nursing homes. There were problems with maintaining adequate voter rolls, such that there were a number of votes cast by persons who were registered to vote but had failed certain matching tests that are designed to ensure that or to check and see whether the information they have given registrars is accurate. And the total of votes cast in this way almost certainly exceeded Joe Biden's margin of victory. And that doesn't mean that the people who cast those votes were ineligible to vote. It doesn't mean they didn't exist. It doesn't mean that they were real voters, but it means that we didn't follow the processes. That creates problems on a number of levels. First of all, those processes exist for a reason. The legislature has long thought that when we do absentee voting, we have to have particular safeguards in place. This isn't a Democratic or a Republican thing, because the laws that require this go way back to a time when absentee voting was not associated with the Democratic Party. It was, both parties, actually, probably more Republicans were voting absentee back then. And because of that, the court has said that the procedures that were required for absentee voting are mandatory. They must be followed. They were not in all instances. This also makes it difficult to go back and be completely confident about the first conclusion I stated, and that is that there was limited evidence of fraudulent votes, because these procedures are designed to make fraudulent votes either less likely to be cast or easier to be detected.
Right. We're talking with Rick Esenberg of the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty. So, just because people want to bottom line it, you found, quote, widespread abandonment of proper procedures, especially when it came to absentee ballots. Did you review and find evidence of fraud of the sort that President Trump or some Republicans have alleged? Any intentional effort to manufacture false ballots to help Biden win, or problems with the machines? Did you find any of that?
No, not at scale. Right. I mean, there were people who, there were, you'll always find some, dead people that voted. You'll always find, in relatively small numbers, you'll be able to find direct evidence of people engaging in skullduggery. But we didn't find that in numbers sufficient enough to affect the outcome.
Yeah, you found
some things.
I'm sorry. You found 300 instances of ineligible voters casting ballots, including 130 felons and 42 dead people. But most of those were caught and weeded out by clerks. So,
right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Now, we looked at whether or not there was a problem with Dominion voting machines, and what we found there is that Trump as a candidate actually did better where there were Dominion voting machines than there were not Dominion voting machines. We looked at whether there was a ballot dump in the city of Milwaukee in the middle of the night. There was not. The reason that there appeared to be was a function of the central count facility that Milwaukee has. And in fact, I actually remember telling my wife at about 2:00 in the morning on election night when I saw that there were, based upon 2016 turnout, that there were lots of votes missing from Milwaukee. I said, this election is basically going to be tied by the morning. One candidate is going to be just a little bit ahead, and one candidate is going to be just a little bit behind, and that's exactly what happened.
If there's one thing that I saw in your report that would tip the scale from Biden to Trump, it would be the 250,000 Wisconsin voters that adopted the indefinitely confined status, which meant they didn't send in a proof of identity when they cast their ballot. And I say this is a big if, but I mean, if there is any claim that procedure or illegality might have cost Trump the election, I think it would be found here. So I just want to ask you about it. These are people that, they're real people. For all investigation and for all we know, these are real people who just didn't follow a procedure. These votes were cast unlawfully, but not fraudulently. Is that a fair characterization?
Right.
Should they have been counted?
Right.
I mean,
right. And it's hard to know how many of them were because, the court has made this question of who can claim in fraudulent, indefinitely confined status kind of amorphous, where the voter himself or herself makes that decision. It can't be because you fear COVID. It's got to be something that, is affecting you already. But there's no effective way to police that. But here's the problem with it. We've had a lot of controversy about photo ID in the state of Wisconsin, and a lot of the public debate about this focuses on photo ID as a device to prevent people from impersonating someone else during in-person voting. And it certainly does do that. But I actually think that the bigger impact of in-person voting is it makes it harder to engage in registration fraud. People might say, well, why is that? You don't need a photo ID to register. And you don't. You can register in Wisconsin based upon easily fabricated information. But once you do that, you won't be able to cast a ballot unless you can show photo ID, which matches to some extent. The address doesn't have to match, but the picture does. The fraudulent registration that you have just executed. And so it really is a break on a major aspect of fraud, and a major aspect of fraud which is probably more likely to be conducted by absentee voting, where somebody to do it. Mm-hmm. The permitting people to just simply claim on their own indefinitely confined status substantially undercuts that perception. Now, what we saw in 2020 is a huge spike in the number of people who were claiming indefinitely confined status. Now, you can say that that was because of the pandemic and people were afraid to go out. That was not, the court ultimately decided, an adequate reason to claim indefinitely confined status, because it interpreted the law to mean that you were indefinitely confined if you yourself had a condition and not that you feared catching one.
Right.
But the numbers were huge, and we found that out of that 269,000, and I'm going to get the numbers. I'm not going to have the numbers precisely correct here.
Right.
54 to 55,000 had never showed a photo ID. Now, does that mean that these were fraudulent votes? No, we can't say that. We tried to do some testing to determine whether or not we could get further insight into that. Those tests were inconclusive, but it does.
It's a question that hangs over the election, and this is what you found. You found all sorts of problems, just as the similar, the recent legislative audit found all sorts of problems that need to be cleaned up because they hang over elections. They will be a constant source of question. Again, reading from your report, it seems clear that voters abandoned the rules for voting indefinitely confined. Drop boxes were used. At least one ballot harvesting event was conducted without statutory authorization. Absentee balloting in nursing homes was conducted contrary to law. Ballots were cured without authorization, and voter rolls were not accurately maintained as required by state and federal law. Those are all things that need to be cleaned up by the WEC and our legislature. Even if your review found no significant problems with voting machines and didn't find anything you could point to that said this election was stolen.
Right, and I want to emphasize that last point, because this is often what we hear. We hear, well, you don't have any evidence of fraud that would be significant enough to flip an election. Now, that's not true if we look nationally. I mean, there are examples of fraud that may have affected the outcome of the election. In this instance, it's hard for us to say because certain required processes weren't followed. But I'm willing to, if I had to take my guess, I would conclude that the margin in 2020 between Biden and Trump would probably exceeded the margin of any potential fraud. But here's the thing: if I tell you that I have figured out a way to hack your bank account and take your money, your response to that is not going to be, well, I don't care because you haven't done it yet, and I'm not going to do anything about it. So I think we can say that while the election in 2020 may not have been stolen, it was not secure, and our elections should be secure. And so, there are some things that we should do to make sure that we do follow these procedures in the future, and we strengthen them where we need to. And I know a lot of people. I was talking to somebody yesterday who said, "Well, wasn't this just a pandemic special? That this is something that will never be repeated again." But it is going to be repeated again because the way that we voted in 2020 for some people becomes the new baseline. And now we can't do away with drop boxes, and we can't do away with ballot correction by clerks, and we can't do away with indefinitely confined status, because if we do that, we're somehow engaged in voter suppression, and that simply isn't the case.
That's exactly correct. I think that's a great summary of why this is all important and why it needs to be clarified and corrected. We're talking with Rick Esenberg of the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty, which has done a careful, exhaustive 7 or 8 month review of the 2020 election. I like that as a countermeasure, your team also looked at what happened nationally and found that Wisconsin followed the general pattern. You had large turnout everywhere. Women in the suburbs sort of turned against Trump, even as his vote increased in the rural areas. There was nothing from the national view that suggested something odd here or fraudulent here either. So let's talk about recommendations. Do you make some recommendations specifically as to clean up the confusion?
Right. I mean, we've made some. Excuse me, getting over a cold. Mm-hmm. We've made some recommendations with respect to structural changes in WEC. I mean, the problem with organizations like GAB and WEC is they tend to become staff captive.
Yep.
That was a huge problem with JB. It was a bit of a problem with WEC, although it's moderated by WEC because they have an even split between Democrats and Republicans. But we've suggested that if there were both Democratic and Republican counsel at WEC, that both sides would have a greater ability to do things other than just say no to one another. So we've sought to clarify the law with respect to the use of drop boxes. If we're going to use drop boxes, then let's have specified processes for how they can use. I mean, WEC basically said you can use drop boxes, and you should probably monitor them, but you don't have to. Well, we should ensure that they are staffed and monitored. We should ensure that some record is kept. One of the reasons that we can't be sure about how many votes were cast in an unlawful manner is that we don't know how many votes were cast by drop boxes. So nobody kept track.
Yeah.
We looked at the impact of this Zuckerberg funding. We found that it was heavily skewed towards Democratic areas, and it had a significant impact relative to the margin of victory on Democratic turnout. And some people might say, well, that's great. People came out to vote who otherwise wouldn't have voted. But the problem is it happened because of an inequitable distribution of resources. And so we suggested that if election officials are going to take private money, that money should be dispersed even-handedly, because in an election where, it's very important for us, for voters to think that the election has been conducted in an even-handed manner, allowing private dollars to come in and assist election administration in some places way more than it assists election administration in other places, and to do it by, encouraging close work between election officials and people who I think are fairly characterized as partisan activists, really undercuts confidence in the election. And so that situation should be cleaned up as well, so that type of thing can't happen in the future.
Yeah, you want to talk about a new type of unfair gamesmanship, if not fraud. It's this Zucker money. We link up the full report on jwebershow.com. We've got it out on social media as well. Thank you very much for your time this morning, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jay. Take care.
Rick Esenberg of the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty. We just sort of scratched the surface. Again, Jay Weber.